Hey there, welcome to the Grow Daily podcast. You're listening to your host, Piyush Agarwal, and this is the third episode of this brand new podcast series. Well, in the last two episodes, we were just setting the mood up. In fact, in the last episode, we did speak about something really important even before we start talking about growing up. That is, your attitude towards failing. I hope you liked the episode. If you haven't heard that episode yet, I would request you to go and first listen to that episode. Trust me, it will add a lot of perspective to what we are going to talk about in this series. On today's episode, even before we start talking about growing up, we need to tackle one more very important aspect. And that aspect is a step that you need to think about before you start talking about growing up. That step is starting up. Since you are already listening to this podcast series, it's very easy for me to assume that most likely you have already started something. You have already started on that side hustle. You have already started on that small project that you have been keeping on the back burner for ages. Or you have already started on that fitness regime, that goal that you have set for yourself in 2019. However, there are many people who are also on the edge, and I don't want to leave them out. So if you are somebody who has been thinking about starting that dream project of yours, this episode is specifically for you. On this episode, we are going to talk about starting up. Let's start with this very podcast, the Grow Daily podcast. Now, the idea of this podcast is not something that I just got one bright day. I woke up and started executing on it. The idea has actually been looming on my mind for almost an year. Yes, you heard it right, an year. It wasn't in the form of podcast to start with, but the core idea was the same, that I wanted to work in ways which will help people and businesses grow, which will help people and businesses see that growing is not about finding those magic beans that would just convert or become the beanstalk in a single day. It's more about those beans, those grains that you grow and tend to every day and watch it grow every single day. Slowly but steadily. And that's where I thought, because I have seen people struggling in their growth phases, in their efforts to keep up with that idea, to keep executing without seeing any results every day. And I felt that I could come in and help them in that process. At the same time, I faced that struggle myself as well. And this podcast was a great way for me to sort of bring some discipline in my own life and also document all the experiments that I get to do with several individuals and businesses, right? Now, it started off with the idea of a blog and then a book and then just being a pure consultancy service for multiple businesses. Only recently did I think that, a podcast would be a better medium, and that too, a daily podcast. Even with that kind of clarity, it did not mean that I could just start this podcast up. This podcast was actually one of the zillion ideas that I have every day. If you are like me, you know what it feels having that amazing idea at the start of the day and doing nothing about it by the end of the day. I did not want this podcast to be one of those ideas that gets shoved away in the trash can or gets locked away in that locker as something that I would like to do one day. So, on 2019 New Year's Eve, I was pretty clear that this year I want to make it count. I want to make the year count where I actually jump on my idea and do things without giving a lot of thought. One issue that I face personally is that I want to do things really well. And in the process of doing things really well, there creeps in the fear of failure, which we spoke about in the last episode, and also the thing about overdoing the specifics. You keep running the idea in your mind, you keep making big plans, you keep adding components, you keep making it more and more complicated and difficult for you, not realizing that in the process, you are actually getting distant from the idea. We do it all the time. We start with something very simple, very basic, like in this podcast, I want to help people grow their businesses. And then we make it something massive. I want to make it into this mega successful empire of digital and physical products, trainings and consultancy and advisory services, all of which will help businesses become mega $1 million businesses. The time it took for this idea to become something small like helping to grow businesses to this mega monster was just a few flicker of seconds, because it doesn't take anything for us to dream and imagine. Now, there's nothing wrong in having that bigger dream, but what happens in the process is that you have kind of bloated the task ahead. And by bloating the task ahead, what has also happened is the work seems humongous, and also it starts seeming unachievable. While in our head we would love to believe that we can do anything that we set our minds on, it should be easier if we take it step by step. And that's where even I was heading. It took me a couple of months even to again drill it down and make it something small that, hey, the more important thing is doing. And I want to make sure that in 2019, I actually end up creating this podcast and delivering it every day. Now, if you look at the episode list of this podcast, it isn't like the first podcast episode was recorded on the 1st of January. It took me a couple of days to get myself up and record that episode. And even after recording and launching my first episode, it took me a while to get to the second episode. I already missed out a day in between. And that's what starting up is all about. Starting up is all about embracing the fear that you may fail, and more importantly, actually starting up. So if you have been on the edge like me, if you have been on the edge thinking about that big idea, or not getting too excited about the idea, or getting scared that the idea seems too big for you to execute, I have one simple small advice. Take the first step. Just get started. Break it down to absolute small pieces and ask yourself, what's the first step going to be? What's that one thing you need to do to legitimately launch that idea, to legitimately get started on that idea? It could be as simple as taking a notebook and a pen and writing down what would it take for you to make that idea a real thing in this world, right? Now, it's very easy to get bogged down by bigger challenges which are sort of unimportant, but in our head, they become very important. If you are going to launch a company, that could be registering your company. You do not need to officially register your company in order to try something out. More importantly, you don't need to have that big office. You don't need to have 10 people working under you. You don't need that amazing shiny office furniture or even that super fancy equipment. These are just roadblocks that we put in our way before we can start on working something. When you're making notes, when you're noting down what that idea is going to be and how you're going to proceed in executing it, make sure you write down what you think you need to execute the idea. Once you have the list down, go through each of those bullet points on the list and ask yourself, do you really need that in order to get started? It's as simple. So the office space, do you really need that office space in order to get started? Can you just work out of your room? Employees, do you really need employees to get started with? If it's a logo that you need, can you just go to one of those umpteen portals online and just find a freelancer who would do it with you? Or even better, do you want to just ask your friends if they can help you out creating that logo? So go through your list and ask yourself, is it something really needed for you to starting up? And if it is really required, how can you do it in a frugal way? How can you do it in the cheapest, in the quickest way possible? Because speed is the most important factor here, right? Once you go through the list, you will realize that you almost have everything that you need in order for you to get started on that idea, on that project of yours. And more importantly, even before you take the first step, on the same notebook, write down why do you want to work on that idea. Now, this aspect is absolutely important. A lot of times we just assume that we know why do we want to do something. We don't really sit and ponder and try to make that effort to find the actual answer. Yes, money can be a big motivation, but a lot of times, if you dig further, you will realize that your motivation for doing something is more than money. And it's very important for you to know that, because when you start something, when you start working on something, the journey is going to be really long. And if you don't know the why, you wouldn't have the driving force, you wouldn't have the motivation to continue working and continue walking on that journey. So find your why, make a note of it, and make sure you never forget it, you never lose it, you always revisit it. I would also recommend, if you haven't already, to go on YouTube and watch this video by Simon Sinek, Start With Why, where he explores and explains the idea that how big companies, successful companies, always start with the question why before they jump onto how and what. Now, once you have all of these points in place, that means you are ready to start. You are ready to take that first step. So take it. Now that you're ready, don't sit on this idea any further. Don't wait to take that first step, because overthinking will happen, your mind will kick in, and again there will be things that will slow you down. So, as I was talking about earlier, perfection is not important, but what's really important is action. So take action, go forward, do the thing, take that first step that will help you know, that will make sure that you have started. And once you have started, you sort of make a promise to yourself to consistently work on that idea, to ensure that you keep growing it, and to ensure that you see it to its end. Some of the ideas do not have an end. That means it needs to have a growth trajectory. Whatever it is, you need to make sure that there's work happening. But even before any work can happen, you need to get started. So don't wait up any longer. We are reaching the end of this episode, so I will not take any more time. Grab that notebook, grab that pen, write your why, what, and how, and make sure you take your first step today. Because tomorrow, we will be talking about how can we grow it further. So that was me, and that was today's episode. You have been an amazing audience. Do give me your feedback. Do let me know if this show is working for you. Do leave a review around if you would like to, and I would be around every day with you to help you grow your business. On that note, signing off, this is Piyush Agarwal from the Grow Daily podcast.